On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. For those of you who are joining us just now after lunch, and for those of you who are joining us for the webcast, I want to just keep repeating that if you're tweeting along, we're hash DGP 2011. Please, you're more than welcome to join the conversation that way. This panel is Teddy Cruz, Jordan Crandall, and Hernan Diaz-Alonso. This is, in essence, the architecture panel. And by way of introduction, I want to, perhaps a bit less architected, a sort of index of thoughts. I was thinking this morning about Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist who's been disappeared in this particularly post-ironic way, and that it was Weiwei's perhaps most egregious transgression was calling attention to the collapsed buildings in the earthquakes and the inadequacy of the legal mechanisms to control the quality of the construction of these and so forth and so on. And I was reminded of Lebbeus Wood's remarks about how that these architectural catastrophes, where and the ways in which, I mean, he was writing about Yugoslavia, but the ways in which architecture can become a tool or a means in its construction and its deconstruction and its formation and its collapse of extraordinary forms of violence that are slow motion, violences that are remote, violences that are prostheticized, but that anything that has that same capacity of violence, by definition, has an equal capacity for whatever we take to be the opposite of violence, both by its construction and by its dissolution. And the three people presenting today have very different and unique takes on what that relationship between architecture and the body and the social role of architecture can be or cannot be, and what its goals can be, and where it's focused. In ways I don't really see them as in competition so much as a kind of as a kind of juxtaposition. So part of the questions that we'll be working through, I think, with this interesting triangulation is how let's call it the architectural imaginary, how architecture sees the world, or how we could see the world as a series or sequence, accumulation of architectural problems. We can draw upon architecture's understanding of the sphere. Peter Sloterdijk, the German philosopher, has this sort of well-known take that the world itself is comprised of a series of overlapping and concentric spheres. Our internal organs are envelopes. Our skin is an envelope. The room is an envelope. The atmosphere is an envelope. We're never outside. We are always inside of a series of overlapping envelopes, which he calls spheres. And the question of the sphere and its relationship, what's designable as a body, I think is the open one. He also talks about the way in which the sort of peculiar strategy on the part of mammals, of course, animals laid eggs for a long time, and then somewhere along the line we decided to internalize the egg, to bring the world back inside, and to make it something that would be inside of us. I'll talk a little bit about each of these. Teddy's work, of course, is much more directly sociological. Hernan's much more biotechnological. Jordan's much more a form of kind of political science. And I look forward to Josh Tarrin's commentaries and moderation. Josh, by the way, was one of Hernan and mine's star students from SciArc, who's now at the University of Calgary and has come down to join us for this. So let me begin by introducing Teddy Cruz. Teddy, as you know, is also at this time organizing an extraordinary event in San Isidro in Tijuana by the Political Equator 3, and we're very grateful for Teddy for taking time from his extraordinarily busy schedule to come and join us today, and also to congratulate Teddy as a new recipient of a substantial Ford Foundation grant. And Teddy, for those of you who don't know him, was born in Guatemala City. He did his master's in design studies at Harvard. and established his practice here in San Diego in 2000. He's been recognized internationally for his urban research on the Tijuana-San Diego border. In 1991, he received the Rome Prize. 2005, first recipient of the James Sterling Memorial Lecture on the City Prize. His work has been profiled in every important design magazine venue that you'd care to mention. He's currently professor in public culture and urbanism in the visual arts department, as long as several faculty here. And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Teddy Cruz. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Benjamin. Yes, it's been a really busy, and it's fantastic because, while we have this conference dealing with the scale of geopolitics, in this weekend we're going to get to the specificity of very interesting environments across the border. So I think it's exciting that these things are happening here, from UCSD outward. So let me begin quickly. Let's see, trying to see where sorry, I cannot, I don't have the PowerPoint here. Sorry. Yes. Oh, there. Perfect, thank you. Wonderful. Yes, I'm thinking, and I just want to keep track of the time here. I'm thinking in the context of this question, or the questions that you've been discussing here, I just arrived, but I cannot avoid thinking of Buckminster Fuller's words at some point when he suggested that any conversation at the scale of the global would begin by meditating on the conflicts across geopolitical boundaries, marginal communities, and natural resources. That was going to really set the tone and ultimately the controversy that would really ultimately redefine our conversation and ultimately the meaning of intervention when we get to the specificity, again, of the territory. So I'm interested in meditating on these sort of conflicts across those registers, but really seeking a level of specificity, to move from the abstraction somehow of much of these conditions that have motivated our debate in terms of globalization, but really get to the level of the specificity of the political and the specificity of the economic, the specificity of conflict embedded in the territory as a point of departure. So I'm thinking of the necessity ultimately to rethink, in fact, the very politics and economics of growth that continue to be at the center of the discussion. Is obvious by now that the way that we have been growing has become unsustainable. For me, this is a problem that is so obvious, but yet never really overtly presented as a kind of device to rethink the institutions themselves and our artistic practices. Not only that is a problem, but the problem is in the way we try to solve the problem. We understand that these emblems of a kind of oil-hungry urbanization that really emerged precisely from our context in Southern California have equally become unsustainable, but the problem, again, really is in the way that we try to solve this problem by camouflaging, in fact, the very politics and economics of growth, of development that have enabled this urbanism and steroids. So many times I say to myself as an architect or designer, without transforming or without fundamentally challenging the very politics and economics that have enabled these institutions of planning, of development, it's very difficult to really produce or advance the culture in our discussion. So I'm thinking that it's essential, of course, to suggest the possibility of producing new correspondences between what we mean by the global and the local, even though those continue to be categories that are very slippery and very difficult to articulate without sounding provincial. But for me, it's been essential to suggest the radicalization of the local as a point of departure. This is, in fact, the diagram that at some point I worked on to articulate the meaning of my practice and my work. Is called the Political Equator. In fact, what frames the discussion this weekend after this event. When I discovered that the Tijuana-San Diego border belongs to a corridor of global conflict between the 30 to 35th degrees north parallel, in a corridor, in a necklace of checkpoints linking San Diego-Tijuana with Ceuta and Melilla, which is the main funnel of migration from Africa into Europe, even the Israeli-Palestinian border, and so on. It produces this figure, this diagram that I ended up coining the political equator, of course, across this global border after 9/11, which in fact the Pentagon's redefining those categories suggests that the conflicts will emerge from the relationship between the non-integrating gap, as the third world is now called, and the functioning core, as the strong economies of NATO primarily are in interaction with each other. The unprecedented flow of migration from the non-integrating gap, seeking the strong economies of the functioning core, and on the opposite direction in the redefinition and decentering of the size of production, the functioning core seeking the cheap labor markets of the non-integrating gap. So people going in one direction, goods and services on the other. This, for me, was essential. And of course, if we really look just beneath the political equator is the climatic equator, and the picture begins to be very clear. The relationship of natural, untapped resources beneath some of the poorest communities in the world, and this reinstating of a global, let's say, urbanization based on fear, anti-immigration, and so on. So the story for me began to, of course, suggest it is time to enable a very different idea of the local, because global conflict, as we all know, once it hits the ground, it transforms and physicalizes itself in these objects that at times I say, transform, in fact, San Diego into the world's largest gated community. And by that, I mean that San Diego in the last years we have been witnessing the hardening of the border wall that continues to harden, and in tandem, the hardening of a social legislature towards the city, of public institutions, the erosion of the public itself in the installing again of this urbanism of fear that has been part of our debate but never really dealt with in terms of its counter possibilities or spaces. My practice has really oscillated between the strategies of the informal understanding the meaning of these slums that crash against the border wall in Tijuana, and of course the politics of discriminating zoning in San Diego, primarily that, and this sort of journey in these two suburbias, observing in fact the transborder invisible flows that define in a very compelling way this environment. This is many times, I think I cannot avoid telling the story for some of you who do not know it, about what has inspired really this observation. Waste going south in the shape of small bungalows that are recuperated by Mexican speculators, as developers in San Diego have been in the last years building a more inflated version of suburbia. These post-war bungalows are sold to Mexican developers and they are transferred into Tijuana, so not only people cross the border, but entire pieces of one city move to another. So these are small houses that are put on top of moment frames, steel frames, leaving the space beneath open-ended for more narrow, other uses and so on. This sort of approximation of opposites, this fearless densification and this sort of layered type of programmatic intensity is very interesting to notice. And of course, the pieces of infrastructure, rubber tires that you've seen for years, but look at what people have already been able to do in conditions of socioeconomic emergency. They figured out how to fold these tires into systems that are a lot more efficient to construct infrastructure. So I'm interested, without sounding too romantic, I hope, the possibility that in these marginal communities there is a creative intelligence that is still alive, and that only in conditions of emergency the imagination is pushed to invent new spaces of operation. And I think that there's no question that in these environments there is poverty and precariousness, but I'm interested in the translation of some of these dynamics in order to produce new political configurations and economic models. Garage doors that construct entire houses in Tijuana. Imagine the old first ring of suburbanization, levee towns. Garage doors are used to construct entire dwellings in Tijuana. So it's obvious that while the precariousness and the informality of this is a seductive sort of image, I'm not interested in the image or the style of the informal. And I would like to suggest that from the beginning, because in architecture it's been, at times people say, well, you are the shanty guy, In reality, I'm interested in forwarding possibly a very different idea of the informal, less as an aesthetic category and instead as a praxis. I think that the practice embedded in these procedures, political, economic, and socially, can be devices to rethink urbanization. The conflicts in Tijuana that I've been interested in engaging is having to do with factories, of course. Many times our work begins with identifying this phenomena embedded in these images, and then identifying a conflict within which we occupy as designers. So factories that place themselves next to the shanty towns in Tijuana to borrow labor without necessarily investing anything on infrastructure. So the conflict between factories, emergency housing, and labor in Tijuana. We've been interested in not going to the slum just to solve the problem of housing, but to get to the source. And I've been interested in engaging institutions to be accountable. So we went to the factories to suggest that with their material systems, we can begin to construct light infrastructures, injecting these systems, just like they are at this moment, into a political economy of waste. So there is an issue of sustainability embedded in these environments, so that is essential. So producing these micro-infrastructures that can begin to thread other systems, such as the houses, the pallet racks, and allow this triangulation. I'm interested in how designers can also design cross-institutional collaboration and accountability in this case. So these systems begin to incrementally visualize what otherwise is invisible in terms of how these environments are shaped by human resourcefulness, collaboration, and exploitation, of course, as well, but embedding the design process into that phenomena. Of course, the most fundamental work in our case is, in fact, the opposite flow. People coming to Southern California in search for dollars, and the impact of immigrants, and I should say the positive impact of immigration in the transformation of the American neighborhood. And I'm interested how, again, there is the absence of systems of representation at the scale of governance between these two cities, Tijuana and San Diego, not one single land use map between these two cities that can really replicate the reality at play. So I had to splice it in a very lyrical way, the large size of zoning in Southern California and San Diego, and to the north in Tijuana, the high pixelation of compacted and alternative uses in Tijuana, suggesting that this confetti of alternative uses has begun to seep into the large, altering the very specificity of those parcels, because when this confetti hits the ground, it alters the nature of these monocultural, homogeneous parcels. So this transformation of these parcels into alternative economic and social systems, for me, suggests that a very interesting possibility, not only to think that the neighborhoods, marginal immigrant neighborhoods, are, in fact, sites of production. See, in terms of the architectural culture, while we were seduced with Dubai and China and these economic centers of power, not that much was advanced really within that framework. I'm thinking that the global city perpetuated itself as a site of consumption. I'm interested in suggesting that border neighborhoods are sites of cultural production, equally of socioeconomic frameworks, such as the Buddhist temple that that retrofitted this post-war bungalow in the neighborhood of City Heights, and in so doing not only altered the kind of one-dimensionality of this parcel into many other possibilities, but it began to, the agency of the Buddhist temple began to produce transactions across the neighborhood in the shape of programming, pedagogical, economic, and so on. So I'm interested in reconceiving citizenship, mainly because I live next to Arizona, of course, less as as the right to have documents to make us belong to a private club, but instead suggest citizenship particularly as a creative act. A creative act that reconfigures, this is very important to me, not only in citizenship, but in practice, but reconfigures institutional protocols and behaviors. I think this possibility is important, mainly when embedded in these alterations, the kind of retrofitting and urbanism of alteration in Southern California by immigrants, we can begin to rethink density, which continues to be perpetuated in reality all over the board, across institutions, in a very abstract way. This is, again, part of this issue for me, moving from abstraction to specificity, moving from the neutrality of policy in its homogenizing of environments to the specificity of the political. So in this case, moving away from density measured simply as an amount of things per acre and move into another more complicated notion of density as an amount of social and economic exchanges per acre. That, of course, would suggest very different modes of representation, how to measure those transactions, and so on. So I'm interested, of course, in the suggestion that the future of Southern California depends on the pixelation of the large with the small, and this suggests the absorption, the kind of inclusion of the alternative uses and economies by immigrants, the two women who rent a 3-bedroom apartment transforming into an illegal micro-nursery that can somehow come in contact with a local community-based nonprofit organization, producing a kind of social contract that enables that to be represented. I'm interested in the idea that political representation is what is needed in the enabling of the visibility of these informal dynamics in the context of these neighborhoods. The other aspect of this, of course, is the possibility that through the rethinking of density and citizenship, we might begin to get to a topic that is, I think, fundamental in our time, when we have noticed that the whole economic collapse seemingly began with people given cheap loans that they couldn't repay. The idea, again, that we need to reframe and recondition the very definition of ownership or property in the context of the American dream, or I should say the mythology of the American dream as promised by home ownership. The democratization of urban development suggests including communities, marginal and so on, environments that can be considered as micro-political units of sorts, understanding again that as we arrive to the specificity of a parcel, just like that Buddhist temple, a parcel becomes a socioeconomic system. So our projects, just to end with this couple of images, our project really gets to that level of specificity. I'm shortening the story because there is a lot of process behind these transactions, but I'm interested in how we begin to articulate a very different idea of housing, a housing economy, and housing as framing a very different, a diverse social composition by producing projects in marginal neighborhoods such as the one I've been working in the last 9 years called San Isidro, in collaboration with a non-profit organization called Casa Familiar. So we've been developing small housing projects. Experimentation can happen in our time at small scales, I think. And to enable these environments to be the sites of investigation at this moment is important. So we are operating, this is one example, in a small parcel in this neighborhood of San Isidro. The nonprofit purchased this church that we are remodeling into a cultural engine of sorts. The church is adapted into a think tank where the nonprofit will collaborate with artists and with architects and so on to produce programs that can be inventive, that can be a lot more effective in engaging communities. Then the series of social rooms with collective kitchens that will inject themselves with Casa Familiar with very specific socioeconomic programming. I'm interested in the designing of critical interfaces between program, space, and people. And in this case, allowing the community itself to collaborate with the nonprofit in this possibility of producing these social contracts to enable really what is ultimately a very amazing socioeconomic entrepreneurship embedded in these communities. So small infrastructures that can mobilize political representation and that can mobilize informal economy and so on. And the housing is stitched through these environments. This is the first typology in a small parcel dedicated to single mothers with children or young couples. And the idea is, of course, to make them participate of the co-managing of the programs of these environments. A duplex that will be dedicated to two artists exchanging rent for social service, so the artists interested in social practice in our time can, in fact, go beyond the representation of community just symbolically, but really activate them operationally. So they become partners in producing projects in this small infrastructure. At the other end of the small parcel, large units for large families who live with grandmothers. So these are units that are designed with shared kitchens, and the nonprofit organization partners with them to enable small businesses and so on. I mean, this, again, idea that somebody has to represent these others is part of the problem with the mortgage crisis, is that people were left to their own devices alone. I think that these nonprofits serve a role as mediating agencies. And the final typology is small sheds. We found out in the building code, talk about specificity. In the building code, if a building is no larger than 120 square feet, it's a room that is 10 by 12 feet. If we give it a 15-foot ceiling height, a utility sink, and a big window, it's a wonderful studio. If it is no larger than 120 square feet, it doesn't need a permit. So these are small buildings that are called accessory units that we can then enable the community to build those units themselves. So in this collection of very specific housing economies, and the diversity of demographics they serve is the way we're thinking can enable the kind of pixelation that I was talking about in terms of different and alternative housing economies that developers don't do. The reason our cities have become hugely homogenizing is because developers cannot afford that level of specificity and so on. Finally, from the idea primarily moving from the neutrality of the public in the way we've conceived it as artists, people will somehow magically come together. Moving from the neutrality of the public to the specificity of rights is something that is fundamental. The rights to the neighborhood, so much the rights to the city, as the city has been co-opted already by very specific logics of development. And finally, the possibility, because I don't want to be also niched into just dealing with small scale, I'm interested in how, from the smallest scale of a neighborhood or a parcel, we can begin to catapult a project that can allow us to reimagine, in fact, the regions. These are the two neighborhoods I've been working with, in fact, the size of the Political Equator event this weekend, San Isidro in San Diego and Laureles Canyon, a shanty town in Tijuana. And from there, the kind of, the reimagination, the reimagining of the region, from the small to the large, to allow us the rethinking of infrastructure itself, and finally, the possibility, which I think is really at stake here, mainly when the notion of the public has been hijacked so easily in this country, where the public itself has become a forbidden word to the society, I think clearly suggests that there is a huge gap between institutions of knowledge, of culture, and of governance, and the public itself. So this reconnection of public policy and the collective's imagination is a design task that we all can engage. Thank you very much.